Welcome to History Addict, the place where we explore the lesser-known stories that shaped America's past. Today, we're diving deep into the experiences of the Northern Cheyenne and the events leading up to the infamous Battle of the Little Bighorn. At the heart of our story is John Stands in Timber, a Northern Cheyenne elder and historian who dedicated his life to documenting the stories of his people. Born on the Northern Cheyenne Reservation in Montana, John grew up listening to the stories passed down by his elders, including his grandfather who survived the battle itself. John Stands in Timber played a critical role in working with historians and anthropologists, preserving the Northern Cheyenne's perspective on this tumultuous time in American history.
Before we begin, don't forget to like and subscribe to support the channel and ensure that these stories continue to reach a wider audience. The story of the Battle of the Little Bighorn, fought on June 25, 1876, is often told through the lens of the U.S. military, focusing on General Custer's infamous last stand. However, the Cheyenne and Sioux warriors were not caught off guard. In fact, the Northern Cheyenne, alongside their allies, had been tracking the movements of the soldiers for days, knowing conflict was inevitable. Lame White Man, a Cheyenne chief and John Stands in Timber's grandfather, had already warned his wife the day before the battle that soldiers had been sighted near the Rosebud River. Scouts had also seen a steamboat delivering supplies along the Yellowstone River, signaling the soldiers' growing presence in the area. Instead of retreating, the Cheyenne and other tribes pressed forward, meeting up with other scouts as they prepared for what lay ahead. This gathering of Native American forces was not accidental. It was the result of deliberate coordination among the tribes, each one aware of the looming threat. On the other side, General Custer and his troops were not completely oblivious to the presence of Native warriors. Crow Scouts, including White Man Runs Him, provided Custer with daily reports about the size and movements of the Cheyenne and Sioux encampments. Despite these warnings, Custer underestimated the number of warriors he was facing. This misjudgment would prove fatal. Once the large Native American camp was established at the Little Bighorn River, Sioux leaders called for a council to determine how they should respond to the approaching soldiers. They debated their options carefully. Some believed the soldiers might want to negotiate, thinking perhaps they were not only there to force the tribes back to their reservations. The decision was made. If the soldiers came in peace, they would speak. But if they came looking for a fight, the warriors would meet them with full force. The leaders did not wish to start a conflict unnecessarily, but knew they had to be ready to defend their people and their way of life. To prevent any rash actions, the Cheyenne and Sioux military societies were tasked with guarding the camp, ensuring that eager warriors wouldn't charge into battle prematurely. These societies, revered for their discipline and authority, took up positions along the river and the surrounding hills. Throughout the night, their members patrolled the camp, watching closely for any movement from the soldiers. Obedience to the military societies was paramount, and the consequences of disobeying their orders were severe. Nevertheless, a few young men, driven by the desire to gain honor in battle, had other ideas. Among those young men was Bigfoot, a friend of my step-grandfather Wolftooth. Bigfoot approached Wolftooth with a bold plan. They could sneak away from the camp, avoid the patrols, and meet the soldiers head-on. If we're clever, Bigfoot reasoned, maybe others will follow us, and we can face the enemy at the Rosebud. The two men studied the movements of the military societies, observing as one group crossed to the east side of the river and another took up position between the hills that would later mark the Reno and Custer battlefields. As night fell, they quietly moved their horses to the west side of the river, pretending to leave them there until morning. Under the cover of darkness, they retrieved their horses and carefully crossed the river, hiding in the brush where they would wait until dawn. Meanwhile, back in the main camp, anticipation filled the air. A group of young Sioux warriors had taken the suicide vow, pledging to fight until death in the next battle. This tradition, originating with the Cheyenne, had been adopted by the Sioux, who referred to it as dying dancing. Many Cheyenne warriors also took the vow, including Little Whirlwind, Closed Hand, Cut Belly, and Noisy Walking. My grandmother, twin woman, remembered that the atmosphere was thick with tension. Everyone knew that these young men would not return from the coming fight. The next morning, a parade was held to honor the warriors who had taken the suicide vow. It was customary to celebrate them before they went into battle. Old men walked alongside them, announcing their impending sacrifice. "Look at these boys. They will not return after the next fight." My grandmother described the procession in vivid detail, recalling how the young warriors carried themselves with dignity, even as the knowledge of their fate loomed over them. After the parade, they returned to their village, awaiting the battle that was sure to come. However, before they could fully regroup, chaos erupted. As some of the boys were swimming, the first shots were heard, signaling the soldiers' approach. Warriors dressed in war clothes rode along the riverbank, shouting warnings that the camp was under attack. People scrambled to find their horses, and in the commotion, Yellow Robe's good horse broke free. He managed to grab hold of a half-broken colt, barely controlling it as it bolted across the hills. Had he had his own horse, he might have been able to join the fight immediately. At the same time, Lame White Man was in a sweat lodge with Tall Sioux when they heard the commotion. They hadn't seen the soldiers approach, but they quickly realized the camp was under attack. Lame White Man crawled out of the sweat lodge, grabbed his rifle, and with only a blanket and moccasins, led my grandmother west of the hills before returning to the battle. As dawn broke, Wolftooth and Bigfoot emerged from their hiding place. They had successfully evaded the camp's patrols and were now prepared to meet the soldiers head-on. The warriors waited in silence, observing the movements of the soldiers. From their vantage point, they saw the dust rising in the distance as Custer's men advanced toward the village. The warriors quickly regrouped and moved toward the ridge's top. When they arrived, they could see the last of Custer's troops disappearing toward the river. Reno's men had already attacked the southern end of the camp, but the warriors were unaware of this at the time. The first skirmishes of the battle began as Custer's men descended the ridge. The warriors, using their knowledge of the terrain, surrounded the soldiers, firing from behind cover. Hanging Wolf, a Cheyenne warrior, later recalled firing from the brush as Custer's men reached the river. He struck a soldier's horse, causing the man to fall. Despite the soldiers' attempts to regroup, they were quickly overwhelmed. Meanwhile, more warriors continued to cross the river, joining the battle as Custer's men tried to make their way up the ridge. The warriors, including the young men who had taken the suicide vow, charged into the fray. Their attack was swift and devastating. Yellow Nose, a Cheyenne warrior, seized the American flag from Custer's troops and used it to count coup on a soldier. This bold act became legendary among the Cheyenne, symbolizing the warriors' victory over the U.S. Army. The battle reached its climax when the Suicide Boys made their final charge. As they rode into close combat, they were met with fierce resistance, but their sacrifice allowed other warriors to close in from all sides. The soldiers were outnumbered and outgunned. By the time the dust settled, Custer and his entire force lay dead on the battlefield. After the battle, my grandmother's brother, Tallbull, prepared a travois to retrieve Lame White Man's body. Tragically, Lame White Man had been mistaken for an army scout by some Sioux warriors who scalped him. His body, along with that of Noisy Walking, was found and brought back to camp for burial. Lame White Man was the only Cheyenne chief to die in the battle, and his death marked a significant loss for the Cheyenne people. In the days following the battle, the Cheyenne and Sioux warriors collected the spoils of war, guns, horses, and clothing left behind by the U.S. soldiers. These items became valuable trophies, both practical and symbolic. Horses, particularly, were a prized asset, and many of the captured mounts were incorporated into the tribe's herds. The battlefield, now strewn with the bodies of both men and horses, became a grim reminder of the ferocity of the fight. My grandmother, twin woman, remembered that the bodies of the fallen Cheyenne were quickly removed and taken across the river for burial. Among them were Roman Nose, Cut Belly, Closed Hand, and Whirlwind, all of whom had taken the suicide vow. The Cheyenne dead were buried near the river, close to where the railroad tracks now run. Lame White Man and other fallen warriors were laid to rest in traditional Cheyenne burial practices. Some say their remains were later moved to a site near the forks of Reno Creek, several miles east of the river. Years later, an old grave was found in this area, containing hides, bones, and personal belongings, leading many to believe it was the final resting place of the warriors who fell at Little Bighorn. After the battle, the Sioux and Cheyenne tribes dispersed, knowing that more U.S. soldiers would arrive soon. Although they had achieved a decisive victory, they were low on supplies, and their large camp could no longer stay together. The tribes split into smaller groups, with many heading toward the Tongue and Powder rivers to prepare for winter. My grandmother's group traveled toward Lodge Grass, where they joined other Cheyennes. Despite the victory, the battle left a deep scar on the survivors. The loss of key leaders like Lame White Man was devastating. In the years that followed, the memory of the battle became a central part of Cheyenne oral history. John Stands in Timber worked tirelessly to ensure these stories were preserved. He collaborated with historians like Margot Liberty to record the detailed accounts of Cheyenne warriors and survivors, providing invaluable insights into the battle from the Native perspective. His work, along with the stories passed down through his family, has given us a more complete understanding of what happened at Little Bighorn. Interestingly, the Native American victory at the Battle of the Little Bighorn was short-lived. The U.S. government, outraged by Custer's defeat, redoubled its efforts to force the Plains tribes onto reservations. By the end of 1877, Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, and many of the other leaders who had fought at Little Bighorn were either killed or captured, marking the end of the Great Sioux War. For the Cheyenne, the battle became a symbol of resistance, but also a reminder of the heavy toll that came with defending their land and way of life. In the years after the battle, many artifacts from the battlefield were collected by both Native Americans and U.S. soldiers. Among them were guns, uniforms, and personal items left behind by the 7th Cavalry. Some of these items were passed down through generations, while others were traded or sold to collectors. Even today, the battlefield at Little Bighorn continues to yield new discoveries, with archaeological digs uncovering remnants of the fight, shell casings, buttons, and even human remains. One enduring mystery from the battle involves the fate of some of the soldiers' belongings, including a large sum of money reportedly taken from the bodies. My grandmother, twin woman, told stories of young Cheyenne men who found silver coins and green paper money in the pockets of the dead soldiers. They used the money to make buckles and decorations, repurposing the soldiers' uniforms into leggings and jackets. According to legend, some of the loot, including saddlebags full of money, was hidden in the hills near Reno Creek. Despite searches, the treasure was never found, leading to speculation that it may still be out there, buried in the rugged terrain. There are also stories of Native warriors who fought at Little Bighorn returning to the battlefield in the years after the battle. My grandmother recalled how a Cheyenne named Lost Leg visited the site days after the fighting had ended. He had returned to search for stray horses, but was overwhelmed by the stench of death that still hung over the battlefield. Many native warriors and their families avoided the area for years, haunted by the memories of the brutal fight and the bodies of their fallen comrades. As for Custer, his body was found on Last Stand Hill, surrounded by the bodies of his men. While some rumors circulated about his final moments, including claims that he had been scalped or disfigured, these were largely disproven. Custer's body, unlike many others, was left mostly intact, a fact that has puzzled historians for years. Some believe that the native warriors may have recognized him as a high-ranking officer and spared him the fate that befell other soldiers, though this remains speculative. John Stands in Timber's grandfather, Lame White Man, was one of the few Cheyenne leaders to die in the battle, and his death left a profound impact on his family and tribe. His name is still remembered today with a marker placed near the spot where he fell, honoring his memory and his role in the battle. As we reflect on the events of the Battle of the Little Bighorn, it's important to remember that history is often more complex than the stories we read in textbooks. The battle was not just about Custer and his men. It was a clash of cultures, a fight for survival, and a moment that forever changed the lives of the Native American tribes involved. John Stands in Timber's work has ensured that the Cheyenne perspective of this battle will not be forgotten. His dedication to preserving his people's history, combined with the stories passed down from his family, has provided us with a fuller understanding of the events that transpired on that fateful day in June 1876. So, what do you think? Did Custer's hubris and tactical missteps seal his fate, or were the native forces simply better prepared for the battle? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you can stay updated on more in-depth explorations of history. Thanks for tuning in to History Addict. We'll see you next time with another journey into the past.